Hi everyone and welcome to today's video, which will be based on NOCTUA NH-U9S chromax black edition, which is kind of interesting because apart from their standard colors, they did the chromax black, and you might already seen a couple of my videos based on that lineup. So today let's first unbox the NH-U9S and then we're going to place it on a CPU to test out temperatures. One thing that I personally really love about NOCTUA is the simplicity of placing the cooler on the motherboard and attaching it to the CPU. So we have well, first of all, a very easy connection. So there's no problem in, for instance, placing the cooler on the motherboard with their Secure Form 2 system, well, mounting system. This is the accessory box that you get inside the box for the cooler. And let's check out what we have here. So you have loads of different instruction manuals. Since we have a socket 1200 now, they added the LGA115X and the LGA1200. You also have the LGA20XX and the AMD instruction manual on how to install and place your NOCTUA CPU tower cooler. Next to that, we have standoffs and screws. These are specifically for AMD. And you have standard AMD mounting brackets for the standard AMD backplate that you get with your motherboard, so you don't have to worry about that. We have here additional standoffs for Intel sockets and the locking nuts and locking screws, and these are the brackets that go on the standoffs, so you just place the locking nuts on top of that. More on the topic of the accessory box, you get a screwdriver, which is always handy and nice to have, and you get thermal paste, you get NARC7, which is a low noise adapter. Since we have one fan over here in this CPU cooler, then you have only one. You get additional mounting hinges if you decide to go with another fan on the other side of the heatsink, and that is all there is to it. And of course you get NOCTUA badge here in this box. Now, when we're talking about some specifications, the complete dimensions of the cooler are 125, 95, 68 millimeters. The complete weight of the cooler, so fan and the heatsink, 524 grams. So the total weight with the NF-A9 PWM fan is 618 grams. As already stated, you already know the compatibility with all the sockets. And then we have some specifications on the NF-A9 PWM fan. So max rotational speed is 2000 RPMs, max rotational speed with LNA, the low noise adapter cable, is 1550 RPMs. Maximum airflow is 78.9 cubic meters per hour. With the LNA is 62.6 cubic meters per hour. Maximum acoustical noise is 22.8 decibels, and with the LNA is 16.3, with maximum input power going up to 1.2 watts, and mean time to failure is 150,000 hours. So yeah, what is there left to say? As usual, you get a quite interesting box. But nevertheless, they always pack their coolers and fans nicely so they don't get damaged during the process of delivery. And here we go. So this is the cooler. It's kind of small, isn't it? You can basically use it for smaller cases with smaller distance from the motherboard to the tempered glass or side panel, since you can see that we don't have a standard 120mm fan, obviously. Now the bottom cold plate is very nicely polished, as on all NOCTUA fans, well, CPU coolers, and you have 5 heat pipes going through the passive heatsink directly to the bottom plate to get better cooling. PWM connection for the fan, and you have rubber pads on front and on the back, so basically the hinges that hold the fan are on basically on the rubber part, and the fan is, let's say, touching the heatsink also with the rubber part, the dampening pads. So this is really cool. And basically, yeah, so let's connect this small cooler in a build and check out the temperatures. From the time that I recorded the first part of the video until now, I actually decided to switch things up a bit, and you can see this looks kind of funny since we have the NH-U9S in a huge case, basically because it can fit, for instance, Cooler Master NR200P or InWin A1 or any kind of similar case that has such a space for this kind of cooler. I decided to place it in this one first of all because this was the only build that I had free for review and placing a CPU tower cooler and to benchmark it, and the other thing is to test it out on AMD Ryzen 9 3900X, and the results are really interesting because in 5 different variations of benchmarks in AIDA64 Extreme Edition I get loads of different temperatures, and this is why on idle the CPU is going around 42.5 Celsius degrees, which is kind of okay. I mean, I think that doesn't matter, any kind of CPU tower cooler would hold this kind of temperature on the Ryzen 9 3900X, except for fully custom loop, which would have it a bit lower. Now for the stress testing only the CPU, because you have loads of other options, the temperature went up to 65.9, and I would say it was also circle. Every single temperature that I mentioned is going to be plus minus 2 Celsius degrees. Now immediately when I added cache with the CPU stress test, it went up to 75.5 Celsius degrees. Removing cache and adding CPU and FPU, the temperature went up to 88, and I think it will go even higher. So I stopped and removed the FPU from the stress test. Now check this out, CPU and system memory 64.5 Celsius degrees, so it went even lower than just stress testing the CPU. Most likely because the system memory was, I would say, helping the CPU containing the load and doing some of the work, so kind of lowered the temperature. And taking that fact into consideration and using the CPU, FPU, cache and system memory, the temperature went up to 83.4 Celsius degrees. Now here we go, just to turn it on a bit. This was just to try out the high-end processor that actually needs higher TDP, and that the NOCTUA NH D15 or D15S would clearly contain the temperature under normal level or normal border of usage load and of course temperature. So basically I wanted to experiment on a high airflow case, which is, and a big case, I would say, 3 120mm fans on front, one as an intake at the back, and still try to see what kind of temperatures it will result. And I would say that only the CPU and CPU system memory and similar stuff, I would think that this cooler would do great work in a smaller case and in gaming even with 3900X. I wouldn't of course recommend overclocking because the temperatures would go even higher as usual, but for casual gaming, or even if you go with a lower graded processor with less core count, of course then less threads, or if you're going with older Intel, then we have core and thread count the same. I think it will contain nicely, just because it has a nice airflow, and if you're not satisfied with only one fan on the NH-U9S chromax.black, you can actually add with additional hinges that can hold additional fan right here in the accessory box. So yeah, you can make a push-pull combination on that heatsink, directly touching the CPU and giving nice thermal dissipation without a doubt. So even though this was a bit of a different benchmark that I usually do, because I always try to acquire exactly where this, for instance, this CPU cooler would go. This is a bit different since I don't have a smaller AMD Ryzen motherboard, and this is basically the smallest case that I could come up with for the ATX. But still, it has a front intake which is quite nice, and that's basically it. So guys, thank you for watching today's video. If you have any comments concerning the benchmarks and the way I approached this one, please do leave them below, and I'll be glad to answer them anytime. And of course, if you like the video, don't forget to click the thumbs up button, subscribe for future content, because it helps the channel grow and gets more awareness to other people, and that's all there is to it. So thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.